I'm Ali Ahmadi. I'm a scholar and analyst of national security and U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East. And today I will be discussing America and Iran's nuclear diplomacy. So in 2015, Iran and 6 major world powers, including the United States, arrived at what's called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. Republicans were immediately opposed to this agreement, and when the Trump administration came to power, they were very hostile towards it. Ultimately, in 2018, the Trump administration pulled out of the deal completely, meant that they reimposed a lot of the nuclear sanctions that had been lifted in the context of the Obama administration initially implementing the agreement. This created what the Trump administration called the maximum pressure campaign, the point of which was to make Iran make a number of new concessions around both the nuclear issue itself and a number of other fields, including Iran's role in regional conflicts and the missile program. This approach ultimately didn't really work. Iran did not make these new concessions, and this approach was criticized by people like presidential candidate Biden and a lot of the national security experts in Washington who would eventually come to fill the ranks of the Biden administration. The issue is that when two countries that are enemies are involved in a sanctions episode, the targeted country is loath to make concessions because concessions would essentially be dual concessions, meaning that they would be concessions onto themselves, but also would weaken the position of that country regarding the next round of security competition. In the context of negotiating the JCPOA, there was what President Rouhani called a win-win dynamic, meaning that both countries were going to get something out of this, and the hope was that this would lower the octane on their enmity in general and create a situation where they competed more civilly and even cooperated sometimes. But when the Trump administration moved out, this really increased the tension significantly. So about a year after Trump moved out of the JCPOA, Iran began to downgrade its participation, meaning that it effectively stopped complying with certain measures of the JCPOA, for example, on uranium enrichment. And also there was another path in which both Iran and the United States engaged in a number of kinetic episodes against each other, sometimes directly, but often through their allies in the region by harming each other's interests. So these were essentially two separate tracks with which there was a tremendous amount of escalation between the two countries over time. So Biden ran for president on the platform that he was going to return the United States to the JCPOA. When he became president, the biggest issue became timing. Who's going to come back to the JCPOA in full compliance first? The Biden administration said that Iran should have to reverse the downgrading of its compliance that it had done over the course of the past few years before the United States would be willing to offer any sanctions relief. Iran, on the other hand, said that sanctions relief must come first. These technical issues can be very difficult to solve, but what makes them solvable is the fact that both sides want the national security benefits that underline the deal, but also because all the different technical issues provide opportunities for middle ground solutions. In that light, Minister Zarif said a few weeks ago on CNN that he would be interested in the two countries coming back to the JCPOA at the same time. This would be choreographed, as he put it, by the European Union, and both countries would re-enter the deal together rather than one going first or the other. The Biden administration immediately rejected this offer, and in the time afterwards, the European Union offered to hold a meeting, invited both Iran and the United States, and other JCPOA participants in it as well. This meeting the invitation was rejected by Iran. Iran essentially wanted assurances that non-nuclear issues would be kept out of this and would be talking about how to get back into full compliance on both sides with the JCPOA. Those assurances were not forthcoming. Several European members of the JCPOA, the UK and France, also seemed to engage in an effort to have Iran censured at the IAEA, which created an environment of one-upsmanship and trying to seek more leverage, which was not conducive. Ultimately, that censure vote was scrapped, creating some amount of guarded optimism around this issue. Also, the Joint Commission of the JCPOA will be meeting sometime soon. The meeting hasn't been scheduled yet, but it will involve Iran and the parties that are still in the JCPOA, including America's allies, the UK and France. For Iran, it is important for the Trump administration's actions in leaving the JCPOA to not be seen as a success, to not be seen as having generated new leverage. So agreeing to anything that isn't the JCPOA as it was previously agreed upon would be seen as a failure. In this context, the Biden administration seemingly refusing simultaneous reentry is seen with a lot of suspicion. There's concern that the Biden administration wants Iran to implement first so that it could then qualify its own reentry into the JCPOA, so that some of the sanctions can be interpreted as either non-nuclear related or somehow else outside of the framework of the JCPOA. For example, some of the sanctions that were implemented under the Trump administration. Now, some people in Washington believe that the reason that initial overture by Zarif was rejected is because the Biden administration had not yet set in place its Iran policy. A lot of key appointments had not yet been made. Some of them were still stalled in front of the Senate. This is because of some of these processes do take time, but also because of the impeachment of the previous president took up some of the Senate's business. Ultimately, if the Biden administration wants to come back into the JCPOA through simultaneous reentry, there is time for that. If it does not, then the conflict is probably going to continue moving forward in somewhat the same way that it did under Donald Trump. The Biden administration has a lot of back channels with which to communicate with Iran, and if it does want to do simultaneous reentry, one can expect some clearer signs of that and some progress to be made at some point soon, presumably before the Nowruz, the Persian New Year holiday that is coming up on March 21st.